But anyway, good morning again. Thank you all for being here today. It's week 2 of our fall series. Last week we started and we said we were going to call it Back to the Bible. We spent the end of the summer not really focusing on our scriptures very much. We were talking about pop culture, which was very fun, but now we're getting back to our scriptures. We had a review session last week. We looked at the table of contents in our pew Bibles. We went through the different categories and genres of literature that the Bible is divided into. We talked about the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They are called either the Pentateuch or the books of Moses or the Torah, depending on your tradition. We looked at the long and dense and complex histories of the Old Testament. They have all their accounts of the Jewish kings, the kingdoms, their triumphs, their failures, their effect their rule had on the Jewish people. We looked at wisdom literature, right? Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and so forth. And we talked about the many, many prophets of the Old Testament. We've got major prophets and minor prophets. We listed the minor ones, the lesser well-known ones, the shorter ones, of course the major ones, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and so forth. And we all know the New Testament a little bit better, right? But we still went through that last week. We have the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, followed by the book of Acts, the Pauline epistles, all written by Paul following his conversion from Judaism to Christianity, which he probably wouldn't have called Christianity at the time. After those were the general epistles, which we're going to hear from later on in the fall. We heard from Hebrews last week. We're going to revisit that at some point. The general epistles are a little shorter. They have different authors and different implied audiences than the Pauline epistles. And of course, the New Testament concludes with the book of Revelation, which really is in its own genre, the genre of apocalyptic literature. So that was an overview. We went into more detail last week of the books of the Bible. It gave us a good idea of how the Bible is structured the way it is, a little bit of why it's structured that way. You see the overall narrative as it unfolds before you, the covenants that are fulfilled, and so forth. But there's one important thing that we missed last week when we were talking about these groupings. There's one factor we didn't mention when we were looking in that table of contents. Maybe if you're looking at it now, you'll have a thought about it, or maybe you can guess it from the title today. We talked a lot about what was listed on those pages last week, but what we didn't talk about, what we didn't mention was the things that were not listed there last week. The things that are not a part of the biblical canon. How many of us are familiar with that term, the term canon? You know what we're talking about when we say canon, right? You might think of Pachelbel at first, but we've all heard it before. The origin of the term canon is actually Greek. It refers to a specific type of reed, a plant that was used to measure things back in the day. So the word canon, at first, it referred to a standard type of measurement or grouping, right? And then it evolved to mean a standard set, right? A standard group, a standard measurement of stories or books, such as the biblical canon. In the modern context, this term is applied to film and literature and television, such as the standard canon of Star Wars or the official canon of Harry Potter or something like that. What we end up with are sets of material that are considered either canonical, part of the canon, or non-canonical, not part of it. In the case of the Bible, we have this official canon, this set of scriptures that was determined over the course of many, many years by the early figures of the church. So it has become that very same table of contents, right, that we were looking through last week. But there are, and many of you probably know this, a large number of non-canonical biblical texts. Even more interesting, there's a large number of non-canonical gospels. So that material that makes it into the Bible as we know it today is only one part of the material that we have available. It's the larger, major part, but it is one part. So a lot of Bibles these days, not our pew Bibles so much, but a lot of Bibles will include supplementary information, with commentaries and footnotes and historical context for each chapter and verse. And some Bibles even include something called, and we're going to have a few other vocabulary terms here today. Some of them include something called an apocrypha, a set of books of another origin or another authorship that are not included in the standard canon. The biblical apocrypha is sometimes included as its own section, maybe between the Old and New Testaments, or else as an appendix following the conclusion of the New Testament. And the term, if you're curious, apocrypha, it comes from the Latin. It's from apokryphos, which means secret or non-canonical. Before that, it came from the Greek apokryphos, which meant to obscure or hide away. It's the texts that have been hidden or lost over the years. Well, the next question, naturally, is what could possibly be included in the biblical apocrypha? What have we been missing out on all this time? What else could there be other than the texts that we all know and love and have been raised on for so many years? Well, the biblical apocrypha, it typically consists of a few different groups of texts that go all the way back to what is called the Latin Vulgate, or the original Latin translation of the Bible. The very first one. That became the official Latin Bible for the Catholic Church for a number of years. Some of these groups of texts were also included in what is called the Septuagint, and we're going to put these words up on the website later. You don't have to remember them all right now. It's a lot of wonky biblical scholar stuff. The Septuagint was the original Greek translation of the Old Testament from its Hebrew origin. So you have two major early translations, the Latin translation, Hebrew to Latin, and the Greek translation, Hebrew to Greek. And these included some texts that are not in our current canon. Now, we all know the texts that are included in our current one. These ones happen to be the same ones that originated with the Hebrew canon. These other ones that were added later have since fallen away as well. But the biblical apocrypha, like the canon it supplements, started out in those earlier translations, and it itself has evolved over the years through different publications and translations. For example, we talked about the first Latin translation, the first Greek translation. They were not entirely the same as our Bible today. Additionally, the original Gutenberg Bible. We all know the story of Gutenberg and his printing press. One of the first books ever printed was the Gutenberg Bible. That included additional books of prayer from the Old Testament that are not in our current Bible. It included an extended version of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Or, for example, the Lutheran Bible. We all know the story of Martin Luther and the Reformation, right? Several hundred years ago, the Lutheran Bible was the first major German translation of the Bible. That included a separate section for these apocrypha, which was based between the Old and New Testaments. That's where Luther thought it should go. It displaced as well some of the texts of the Old Testament from the places they're in now, and it put them in a separate section instead. Additionally, Luther, we all know that Luther had very, very strong opinions, right? Martin Luther did. He disputed the inclusion of several of the general epistles in the New Testament, including Hebrews, which we heard from last week, James, Jude, and Revelation. So you begin to see how the issue of canon is not just an issue of stuff that wasn't included, but stuff that is included that people maybe didn't want included originally. Later publications, such as the Clementine Vulgate or the King James Version, which we've all heard quite a bit about, at one point had even more changes. At one point they included texts such as the book of Judith, some lost material from the book of Esther, Ecclesiasticus or Sirach, the epistle of Jeremy or Jeremiah, the Song of the Three Children, the story of Susanna, and the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, don't ask me what's in all of these books. I'm not even sure. I do know a little bit about what's in the books of Maccabees based on my study of Hebrew history, but even there my knowledge is limited. The point is, there's a lot of other material out there that has fallen away over the years. All of these texts, for one reason or another, have fallen away from the biblical canon. And that's just the Old Testament, mostly the Old Testament. We also have New Testament Apocrypha. We talked about additional Gospels, right? These include a lot of writings from early Christians giving accounts of Jesus' life, his ministry and teachings, as well as accounts of the earliest apostles, and reflections on the nature of the Christian God as he was experienced back then. And those alternative gospel accounts included the Gospel of Thomas, right? Doubting Thomas, one of the original disciples. The Gospel of Peter, the disciple. The Gospel of Nicodemus, which is also called the Acts of Pilate. What an interesting title for that one. The Gospel of Bartholomew, another one of the 12. The Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Judas, and the Gospel of Mary, which gives an account of additional dialogue between Christ and the disciples following the resurrection, and it's from the perspective of Mary Magdalene. That was one that Reg Crawford brought up last week, and he was hoping we'd get into it. So good news for Reg. We got into it right away this week. Some of these texts, such as Peter, are additional tellings of the Passion story, which we know already from the canonical Gospels. Some of them, such as Thomas, are tellings of Christ's teachings, and some of them give more dialogues like the one in Mary. Some are thought to be first-hand accounts, while others are believed to be recordings of testimonials by early church historians. So again, there's a lot of material out there. So the challenge for us becomes this: how much weight can we, or should we, give to these additional texts? We don't have them in front of us right now, but you can find them. And how much should we trust the authority of the earliest church figures who helped to develop our current biblical canon? It's challenging, isn't it? Do you find it challenging to know that there are all of these additional texts and accounts out there, not only from the Old Testament, but from the actual story of Jesus Christ? How did we end up with this set of scriptures before us, neatly organized in this little blue book? Well, as we've said, it was a long, evolving process based on many different factors. The early apostles and historians of the church, they had a similar challenge of trying to figure out which prophetic writings were indeed prophetic and which gospel accounts were indeed accurate and truthful. Now, this doesn't mean that any of these apocryphal writings we're talking about are deceitful or untruthful in any way. What it does mean is that the biblical canon was determined by a roundabout process of spiritual discernment. Right? It wasn't always that the orthodox powers of the church said this is heretical and inappropriate and it doesn't belong. Sometimes it's just about texts that resonated with people and other ones that fell away. That process of spiritual discernment is still going on in today's church. Now, our biblical canon is unlikely to change anytime soon, but we are, as a church, still discerning. For the most part, we believe that our scriptures are complete. But we also believe in a process of faith formation that is helped along by all of these different factors: church authority, traditions, supplemental texts, by the gospel that we know, and the gospel that we don't yet know. So here's what I'll say about the apocryphal texts. Go read them if you want to. They can be fascinating and enlightening. Or stick with the canonical Gospels, if that makes you more comfortable. And rest assured that the true nature of Jesus is revealed through them, as experienced by early Christians. What none of us should do is to ever doubt the amazing, transformative power that abides in God and Christ. The power to transcend all discussions about canon and all timelines and all histories. Let us never doubt God's ability to reach us where we are. In the ancient world or in the modern one, through text or tradition or spirit or prayer. God will always be speaking to us in one form or another. And all we have to do is listen. Thanks be to God, and amen.